Imagine being a German soldier, captured in WWII, expecting a weak, defeated enemy, and instead, you walk into a factory producing tanks faster than your entire army back home. For these soldiers, the world they thought they knew had been shattered. They had fought across Europe, endured bombings, sieges, and endless battles, believing their opponents to be exhausted and resource-strapped. Captured and sent across the Atlantic, they anticipated hardship, cold barracks, meager food, and the grim reality of defeat. But what awaited them in America was far beyond anything they could have imagined. As the trains rumbled into the heartland of the United States, rows of POW camps came into view. Some were located in quiet, rural areas, far removed from the chaos of war, while others were surprisingly close to bustling towns. The German soldiers, hardened by years of combat, prepared for the worst. They expected misery, but what they encountered instead was order, cleanliness, and surprising comfort. Thousands of German soldiers landed in America, expecting harsh camps. What they found left them stunned. Their barracks were well kept, with sufficient food, recreation, and even access to books and newspapers. Unlike the brutal conditions they had faced on European battlefields, the camps offered structure, safety, and predictability. POWs had time to reflect and observe the nation that had captured them. But it wasn't just the camps that amazed them, it was the country itself. Rolling farmland, neat towns, and bustling streets greeted their eyes. Civilians went about their daily lives in a way that seemed almost surreal to men who had seen the devastation of war. America appeared, untouched by the horrors that had ravaged Europe, and everywhere they looked, there was evidence of efficiency and progress. Then came the factories. Entering an American factory was like stepping into another world. Machines roared to life, sparks flew from welding torches, and assembly lines moved with a precision that left the POWs speechless. Tanks rolled off the line, faster than their own army could produce in a month. Planes were constructed with such speed and accuracy that it felt almost impossible. Even the veterans of European battlefields struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The scale of production was staggering. Entire factory floors stretched for hundreds of meters, filled with workers, machines, and conveyor belts, all moving in perfect synchrony. POWs could not believe their eyes. This was a war effort unlike any they had seen. Every nut, bolt, and steel plate seemed to have a purpose, every worker performing their task with methodical precision. The hum of machinery, the rhythm of production, and the sheer volume of output created a sense of awe and disbelief. Even when assigned to work in farms or factories, the POWs were given glimpses of America's industrial might up close. They became, unwillingly, students of efficiency. They observed how raw materials were transformed into powerful weapons of war, how men and machines worked together seamlessly, and how a nation could mobilize its resources on an almost unimaginable scale. These first impressions left an indelible mark on the POWs' minds. Many wrote in diaries and letters about their astonishment, trying to capture the surreal experience of witnessing such efficiency. They compared it to their own factories back home and realized that Germany, despite its military prowess, could not match the sheer industrial output of the United States. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, production lines could be just as decisive as the battlefield itself. By the time they left the factory floors, these captured soldiers had gained a new perspective. They were no longer just prisoners, they were witnesses to a force so powerful that it could shape the outcome of the war without ever firing a shot. America's industrial power was a weapon in its own right, and for German POWs, the reality was humbling, shocking, and unforgettable. Thousands of German soldiers landed in America, expecting harsh camps. What they found left them stunned. For men who had endured the relentless horrors of battlefields across Europe, the idea of capture usually conjured visions of suffering cold, crowded barracks, meager rations, brutal discipline. They imagined a land weakened by war, where prisoners would be left to rot, overlooked by a nation too burdened to care. Yet, from the moment they stepped off the transport ships and trains, reality challenged every assumption they had carried with them. The first thing that struck them was order. POW camps in the United States were meticulously organized, far from the chaos of war-torn Europe. Barracks were clean, beds were provided, and the soldiers had access to food that, while simple, was plentiful and consistent. Unlike the trenches and encampments they had fled, these camps offered stability, a stark contrast to the uncertainty and danger of life on the front lines. For many, it was bewildering. They had been trained to see the enemy as cruel and merciless, Yet here was a system that treated them humanely, even with respect. Beyond the barracks, the Germans encountered a society that seemed almost surreal. Small towns, quiet farmland, and bustling streets gave the impression of a nation untouched by the destructive forces of war. They watched civilians going about their daily lives, children playing, shopkeepers tending to their stores, neighbors chatting casually, and it was unlike anything they had seen in Europe. The POWs were not just prisoners, they were spectators of a society that functioned with a calm, efficient rhythm that their own war-strained homeland had long lost. Even within the camps, POWs were allowed structured routines. Many had access to schools, recreational activities, and libraries. They played sports, attended lectures, and engaged in crafts or music. While this might seem ordinary to a civilian, for soldiers hardened by years of conflict, it was extraordinary. It gave them time not only to recover physically, but to observe, to reflect, and inadvertently, to learn about the nation that had captured them. Work programs added another layer to their experience. Some prisoners were assigned to farms, where they helped harvest crops, while others were sent to factories contributing to America's war effort. Even in these roles, which might have seemed menial, the German soldiers were exposed to the country's vast industrial capacity. They saw raw materials transformed into vehicles, weapons, and tools with a speed and precision that left them awestruck. The efficiency, scale, and organization of these operations were unlike anything they had encountered before. This exposure challenged their deepest assumptions. Many POWs had believed that America, distant and supposedly inexperienced in warfare, could never match Europe's military power. Yet, seeing the scale of production, the orderliness of society, and the disciplined workforce, they began to understand that power is not measured only in soldiers or battles won, but in the ability to organize, mobilize, and produce. Letters and diaries from these prisoners often reflected a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and a grudging respect. They described factories that seemed endless, farmland that seemed pristine, and towns that seemed untouched by the chaos of war. Some even remarked on the surprising kindness of American guards and civilians, small acts that further amplified the sense of contrast between expectation and reality. By the end of their first weeks in America, the POWs' perspective had begun to shift. They realized that the United States was a nation of immense capability, where order, productivity, and organization were not just ideals but a practical reality. For many, this first impression would remain with them long after the war ended, a memory of a country whose power was not only in its soldiers but in the efficiency, scale, and ingenuity of its people. In short, for thousands of German soldiers, their first impressions in America were nothing short of a revelation. What they had expected to be harsh captivity became a window into a nation's strength, leaving them stunned, humbled, and forever changed. The streets were buzzing, the buildings gleaming, and the POWs couldn't believe their eyes. For German soldiers captured in World War II, America was supposed to be a distant, under-prepared land. They had envisioned a country struggling under the weight of war, a nation that could be conquered or easily managed. But the reality was nothing like that. From the moment they arrived, their eyes were filled with a scene that seemed almost unreal, a society alive with energy, progress, and meticulous order. As the POW trains rolled through towns and cities, soldiers observed streets crowded with cars, trolleys, and pedestrians, all moving in smooth synchrony. Shop windows displayed neatly arranged goods, advertisements proclaimed consumer abundance, and streetlights illuminated clean, well-paved roads. Unlike war-torn Europe, there were no bombed-out buildings, no rubble-strewn avenues, no desperate civilians. Instead, there was life, efficiency, and a sense of modernity that was almost breathtaking to men who had seen cities reduced to ash. Buildings rose with a sense of permanence and pride. Factories, office buildings, and homes were well kept and organized, a reflection of a society that valued both function and appearance. Every detail, from freshly painted storefronts to neatly trimmed lawns, seemed to proclaim order and progress. For the POWs, many of whom had seen European towns gutted by bombs or stripped bare by occupation, this was a shock to the system. How could a nation, supposedly embroiled in war, maintain such infrastructure? How could its citizens live with normalcy while conflict raged across the globe? The buzz of activity extended beyond the streets. Markets were full of food, people laughed and conversed openly, children played in parks, and public transportation ran with precision. POWs who had expected scarcity, rationing, and despair were confronted with abundance, productivity, and a visible sense of civic pride. Even small details, like orderly sidewalks, functioning traffic systems, and clean public spaces, told a story of a country capable of maintaining balance amidst global chaos. Beyond the immediate visual impact, the towns and infrastructure revealed America's deeper strength. Roads connected factories, farms, and cities efficiently, enabling the rapid transport of goods and raw materials. Rail lines and shipping ports were well maintained and heavily used, critical arteries supporting the nation's war effort. POWs could not help but notice how interconnected the system was, how every part of the country seemed to contribute to a larger purpose. It was not chaos. It was an engine of industry and logistics operating at a scale they had never imagined. Even the rural areas offered surprises. Farms stretched for miles, fields neatly divided, crops harvested using modern machinery that sped the work along. The POWs were sometimes assigned to assist with farm work, and while doing so, they marveled at the combination of manpower and mechanization. The efficiency of the American agricultural system complemented the industrial power they would later witness in factories, giving them a glimpse of a nation capable of supporting both its people and a massive war effort. For many POWs, these towns were more than just places to pass through. They were a revelation. They represented what a nation could achieve with organization, planning, and an industrious population. Soldiers accustomed to destruction and scarcity in their homeland could not reconcile the juxtaposition. A country at war yet thriving, busy yet orderly, strong yet seemingly untouched by the chaos of conflict. By the end of their first days in America, the POWs were left with a profound impression. The streets, the buildings, the bustling markets, and the efficient infrastructure painted a picture of a nation far stronger, far more capable, and far more organized than anything they had expected. It was a shock to their assumptions, a challenge to their pride, and a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. For German soldiers, seeing America's towns and infrastructure was not just a surprise, it was a revelation. It proved that power is not only measured by soldiers on the battlefield, but by the ability to organize, maintain, and mobilize a nation efficiently. And for those who witnessed it firsthand, the lesson was unforgettable. Step inside an American tank factory in 1943. Machines roar, assembly lines move like clockwork, and weapons roll out by the hundreds. POWs were speechless. For German soldiers captured in World War II, stepping into an American factory was like entering another world. After witnessing the organized towns and bustling streets, they had a sense of what America's society could accomplish. But the factory floor revealed the full extent of the nation's hidden power. The scale, precision, and speed of production left the prisoners in awe, challenging everything they had been taught about the capabilities of the enemy. As the POWs entered the factory, the first thing that hit them was the noise. Machines roared like living beasts, conveyor belts hummed tirelessly, and the clanging of metal rang across vast spaces. Sparks flew from welding stations, and enormous engines were lifted by cranes with ease. Everywhere, workers moved with a disciplined rhythm, each performing their task with mechanical precision. The soldiers could hardly believe their eyes. This was not the slow, halting production they had witnessed in Europe. It was a war machine in full operation. Assembly lines stretched for hundreds of meters, filled with partially completed tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles. Each worker seemed to be part of an enormous, coordinated effort, where every bolt tightened, every panel welded, and every engine mounted contributed to the greater whole. The Germans, accustomed to smaller, slower, and often disrupted production lines back home, were stunned by the sheer efficiency and organization. The factory was not merely a workplace, it was a symbol of America's industrial power and its ability to sustain a massive war effort. POWs could not ignore the speed of output. Tanks rolled off the lines faster than their own army could hope to produce in a month. Aircraft engines, precision machined parts, and weapons systems emerged fully functional, ready for deployment, seemingly without pause. The soldiers' initial disbelief gave way to a grudging respect. They realized that the war they had been fighting was about more than just courage or strategy. It was about production, logistics, and industrial might. The technology amazed them as well. Machines they had never seen before performed complex tasks with accuracy and speed. Welding robots, hydraulic presses, and conveyor belts moved in perfect synchronization, reducing human error and increasing efficiency. Even the layout of the factory floor was optimized for speed, with raw materials entering one end and finished vehicles rolling out the other. German POWs, many trained as soldiers rather than Engineers struggled to comprehend the organization, the planning, and the innovation behind every operation. Some prisoners were assigned light work in the factories under supervision, giving them an intimate look at the process as they handled tools, assisted with assembly, or observed skilled American workers. They began to understand the secret behind the war effort. It was not just manpower, but systems, organization, and relentless efficiency. Every day on the factory floor became a lesson in how a nation could convert raw materials into weapons of war with astonishing speed. Beyond the technical marvels, the POWs noticed the morale and energy of the workforce. Americans were focused, cooperative, and seemingly tireless. The factory buzzed with a sense of purpose, as if every worker understood their role in a larger mission. For German soldiers, who had seen their own people exhausted, demoralized, and stretched thin by years of war, this display of dedication was humbling. It became clear that victory was being built not only on battlefields, but on factory floors, one tank and one plane at a time. By the time the prisoners left the factory, their perspective had shifted profoundly. The experience was more than a revelation, it was a lesson in modern warfare. They had witnessed the combination of technology, organization, and sheer human effort that gave the United States an advantage no army alone could achieve. For these POWs, the American factory was not just a building filled with machines, it was the beating heart of a nation at war, and it left an impression they would never forget. In the minds of German soldiers, the tank factory became a symbol of something far greater than steel and machinery. It represented ingenuity, discipline, and an industrial power capable of shaping the outcome of a global conflict. And as they returned to their camps each night, the memory of roaring machines and rolling tanks would linger, a constant reminder that in this war, production lines could be just as mighty as the front lines themselves. One factory could produce more tanks in a week than Germany could in a month. The Germans were dumbfounded. For German POWs, the first glimpse of an American factory had been astonishing, but seeing the scale of production in full motion was nothing short of mind-blowing. These soldiers, hardened by years of combat and trained to respect military might, could not comprehend how, through the production process at a staggering pace, engines roared to life, turrets were installed, and weapon systems were calibrated all simultaneously, all without pause. POWs could hardly believe what they were seeing, a single factory generating what their own factories would take an entire month to produce. It wasn't just speed that impressed them, it was coordination. Every worker knew their role. Every machine operated in perfect timing, and the flow of materials was optimized to eliminate delays. From raw steel to fully assembled tanks, the process was a seamless choreography of efficiency. POWs, many of whom had worked or observed German factories, compared the two and found their homeland's war production lacking. German assembly lines were slower, often disrupted by shortages, bombings, or logistical bottlenecks. America, by contrast, seemed unstoppable. The scale extended beyond a single factory. Across the United States, similar plants were producing planes, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies in quantities that dwarfed anything in Europe. POWs who were sent from camp to camp began to notice a pattern. No matter the location, the factories were massive, organized, and producing relentlessly. It was a nation mobilized not only for war, but for mass production on a level that Germany could barely imagine. Even the smaller details contributed to the awe-inspiring scale. Parts were standardized, workers trained in specialized tasks, and assembly sequences optimized to reduce downtime. Every bolt, panel, and engine component had its place. The Germans, accustomed to inefficiencies and material shortages, watched as hundreds of tanks rolled off the lines week after week. Some of them scribbled notes in secret diaries, struggling to put into words the scale of what they were witnessing. The psychological impact on the POWs was immense. Many began to realize that the outcome of the war was being shaped not just on the battlefield, but inside these factories. A tank completed here, a plane assembled there, each machine represented a force multiplier far beyond the individual soldier's efforts. The Americans' industrial might was, in itself, a weapon, capable of producing enough material to overwhelm any opposing force. Even when POWs were tasked with assisting in production, they became part of this immense operation. Though in small ways, every screw tightened, every panel installed, and every minor task revealed a fraction of the complex orchestration that powered the factory. The experience left many in awe, forcing them to reassess everything they had believed about the war and the enemy. By the end of their exposure, German soldiers carried with them a sobering realization. America's production capacity was not just impressive, it was decisive. Tanks, planes, and vehicles flowed off the assembly lines faster than they could ever be countered in battle. The factory floor was a silent battlefield, and here, the Americans were winning with the power of machines and organization rather than bullets and artillery. In the minds of these captured soldiers, the lesson was clear. Speed, coordination, and scale could turn the tide of war just as much as courage or strategy. One factory could outproduce an entire division back home, and in that realization, the POWs found themselves humbled, astonished, and forever changed. For them, the American industrial machine was a force unlike anything they had ever encountered, a reminder that wars are won not only by soldiers on the front lines, but by the relentless hum of factories producing weapons of unmatched scale and efficiency. They had never seen machines so precise, so fast, it was like a war on hyperdrive. For German POWs in America, the first factory visit had already left them astonished. But the deeper they explored, the more they realized that America's true power lay not just in numbers, but in technology. Every machine seemed to hum with purpose, every assembly line operated with unmatched precision, and the speed of production made their own war industries back home appear antiquated. It was not just production, it was innovation in motion, a symphony of metal, mechanics, and human ingenuity. Walking through the factory, the POWs were overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the machinery. Hydraulic presses, automated conveyors, and welding equipment performed tasks with an accuracy that human hands could scarcely match. Engines were aligned, components calibrated, and frames welded together in ways that left even experienced soldiers shaking their heads. They had fought battles where precision often meant life or death, but here, precision was industrial, magnified across hundreds of machines working simultaneously. The pace of work added to the shock. Machines operated continuously, and workers moved in perfect harmony with the mechanical rhythm. Tanks, planes, and trucks rolled off the lines at astonishing speeds. One could stand and watch as a vehicle transformed from raw steel to combat-ready machine in a matter of days or even hours for smaller components. POWs, accustomed to slower, often disrupted production in Germany, could not believe how quickly everything was completed without error. It was efficiently taken to an almost supernatural level. Automation played a major role in this technological marvel. Machines that the POWs had never imagined were performing tasks that once required entire teams of men. Bolts were inserted automatically, welding arcs danced with precision, and engines were tested and calibrated by machines with a level of consistency unmatched by any human. The Germans began to realize that American factories had minimized the unpredictable nature of human error, creating a production system that was virtually unstoppable. Even the organization of the workspace contributed to the sense of awe. Every part, tool, and component had a designated place. Workers moved in synchronized patterns, each step timed to complement the machine beside them. POWs noticed that there was no wasted motion, no downtime, everything was optimized. It was as if the factory itself had a mind, a blueprint of efficiency guiding every worker and machine. For soldiers trained in war, it felt like witnessing a new kind of battlefield, one where the enemy fought not with soldiers, but with technology. The psychological impact on the POWs was profound. Many had been taught to see America as distant, untested, and unprepared for real warfare. Yet here, they were confronted with a reality far beyond expectation. Machines that could outpace, outwork, and outthink human labor. The concept of industrial might took on a new meaning. It was not just numbers of tanks or planes, but the sophistication, speed, and precision with which they were produced. Even minor tasks revealed the depth of innovation. A single worker might be responsible for one step in a process that, taken alone, seemed simple, but as part of the machine's choreography, it contributed to a production line capable of churning out dozens of combat-ready vehicles each week. The POWs could not help but compare this with the fragmented, slower, and less automated processes in German factories. The difference was staggering. By the time they left the factory floor, the German prisoners carried a mixture of awe, disbelief, and begrudging respect. They had seen the future of warfare in motion, a combination of human skill and technological precision that made production a weapon in itself. For these soldiers, the lesson was clear. Battles could be fought and won long before the first shot was fired. And America's factories were already winning the war on innovation and efficiency. In the minds of the POWs, technological shock became a permanent lesson. It was a reminder that in modern warfare, strength was measured not just by soldiers or guns, but by machines, automation, and the speed at which a nation could transform raw materials into weapons of war. To them, America's industrial hyperdrive was as awe-inspiring as it was unstoppable, and it would leave a lasting impression for the rest of their lives. They had never seen machines so precise, so fast. It was like a war on hyperdrive. For German POWs in America, the first factory visit had already left them astonished. But the deeper they explored, the more they realized that America's true power lay not just in numbers, but in technology. Every machine seemed to hum with purpose. Every assembly line operated with unmatched precision, and the speed of production made their own war industries back home appear antiquated. It was not just production, it was innovation in motion, a symphony of metal, mechanics, and human ingenuity. Walking through the factory, the POWs were overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the machinery. Hydraulic presses, automated conveyors, and welding equipment performed tasks with an accuracy that human hands could scarcely match. Engines were aligned, components calibrated, and frames welded together in ways that left even experienced soldiers shaking their heads. They had fought battles where precision often meant life or death, but here, precision was industrial, magnified across hundreds of machines working simultaneously. The pace of work added to the shock. Machines operated continuously, and workers moved in perfect harmony with the mechanical rhythm. Tanks, planes, and trucks rolled off the lines at astonishing speeds. One could stand and watch as a vehicle transformed from raw steel to combat-ready machine in a matter of days or even hours for smaller components. POWs, accustomed to slower, often disrupted production in Germany, could not believe how quickly everything was completed without error. It was efficiency taken to an almost supernatural level. Automation played a major role in this technological marvel. Machines that the POWs had never imagined were performing tasks that once required entire teams of men. Bolts were inserted automatically, welding arcs danced with precision, and engines were tested and calibrated by machines. With a level of consistency unmatched by any human, the Germans began to realize that American factories had minimized the unpredictable nature of human error, creating a production system that was virtually unstoppable. Even the organization of the workspace contributed to the sense of awe. Every part, tool, and component had a designated place. Workers moved in synchronized patterns, each step timed to complement the machine beside them. POWs noticed that there was no wasted motion, no downtime. Everything was optimized. It was as if the factory itself had a mind, a blueprint of efficiency guiding every worker and machine. For soldiers trained in war, it felt like witnessing a new kind of battlefield, one where the enemy fought not with soldiers, but with technology. The psychological impact on the POWs was profound. Many had been taught to see America as distant, untested, and unprepared for real warfare. Yet here, they were confronted with a reality far beyond expectation. Machines that could outpace, outwork, and outthink human labor. The concept of industrial might took on a new meaning. It was not just numbers of tanks or planes, but the sophistication, speed, and precision with which they were produced. Even minor tasks revealed the depth of innovation. A single worker might be responsible for one step in a process that, taken alone, seemed simple, but as part of the machine's choreography, it contributed to a production line capable of churning out dozens of combat-ready vehicles each week. The POWs could not help but compare this with the fragmented, slower, and less automated processes in German factories. The difference was staggering. By the time they left the factory floor, the German prisoners carried a mixture of awe, disbelief, and begrudging respect. They had seen the future of warfare in motion, a combination of human skill and technological precision that made production a weapon in itself. For these soldiers, the lesson was clear. Battles could be fought and won long before the first shot was fired, and America's factories were already winning the war on innovation and efficiency. In the minds of the POWs, technological shock became a permanent lesson. It was a reminder that in modern warfare, strength was measured not just by soldiers or guns, but by machines, automation, and the speed at which a nation could transform raw materials into weapons of war. To them, America's industrial hyperdrive was as awe-inspiring as it was unstoppable, and it would leave a lasting impression for the rest of their lives. Schools, libraries, even recreation POWs were treated better than they expected, giving them time to observe America's unstoppable production. For German soldiers captured in World War II, Life as a prisoner of war in America was a shocking departure from what they had imagined. They had anticipated harsh treatment, overcrowded barracks, and meager rations, the grim reality of captivity. Instead, they found a structured, surprisingly comfortable environment that allowed them not just to survive, but to observe and reflect on the society that had captured them. One of the most striking aspects of daily life in the camps was education. Schools were set up for POWs to learn a range of subjects, from language and literacy to technical skills. Some attended classes on mechanics, farming, or industry, gaining insights that went far beyond what their military training had offered. These schools gave them time to think, to plan, and to see the American way of organizing knowledge and labor. For soldiers trained to focus on combat, this was an unexpected and humbling experience. Libraries were another window into American society. POWs had access to books on science, history, literature, and engineering. They could spend hours reading about subjects that fascinated them, from agricultural techniques to industrial innovation. Many German soldiers were surprised by the depth and quality of the materials available. In these quiet moments, away from the chaos of the battlefield, they could understand how America had cultivated not just manpower, but intellect, a nation capable of thinking systematically, innovating, and improving processes at a scale few could imagine. Recreation played a surprisingly important role as well. POWs had access to sports, games, and organized activities that kept morale high and provided a sense of normalcy. Soccer matches, volleyball games, and music sessions allowed soldiers to relax, bond, and momentarily escape the stress of imprisonment. Yet even in these activities, the structure and organization of the camps impressed them. Every detail was managed with precision, demonstrating that America valued discipline, efficiency, and order not only in factories and towns, but in the daily lives of prisoners as well. This combination of comfort, education, and recreation gave POWs something invaluable: time to observe. While they might have expected idleness or despair, the camp routines allowed them to study the surrounding world. They watched trucks and trains deliver supplies, farmers transport crops, and factories produce at a relentless pace. They saw a society functioning smoothly, efficiently, and purposefully, even under the strain of global conflict. The contrast with war-torn Europe was stark. While German civilians and soldiers struggled with shortages and chaos, America moved forward, organized, and productive. The psychological effect was profound. Many POWs wrote in diaries about their astonishment at the balance of comfort and efficiency. They began to realize that the strength of a nation was measured not only by its military might, but by its ability to maintain order, educate its people, and sustain production under pressure. Even in captivity, they were witnesses to a system that functioned with precision, a society where every cog, human, mechanical, or organizational, had a place and a purpose. In some cases, POWs participated in camp committees or volunteer programs, helping maintain order, assisting in workshops, or teaching fellow prisoners. This involvement further revealed how America had created a microcosm of its broader society. Within the camp, structured, efficient, and remarkably productive, each day became a lesson in planning, coordination, and resource management, reinforcing what they had already observed in towns, farms, and factories. By the end of their first months in the camps, German prisoners carried a profound impression. Life in captivity had offered them more than survival. It had given them insight into the machinery of a nation at war. Schools, libraries, recreation, and organized routines allowed them to witness firsthand the relentless American production that would dominate the global conflict. They had expected misery and hardship, but found instead a society of discipline, efficiency, and resilience. In the minds of POWs, daily life in American camps was a revelation. It demonstrated that victory in modern warfare required more than courage and strategy. It required education, organization, and the ability to sustain production and morale. For these soldiers, their time in captivity became an unforgettable lesson in the true power of a nation operating at its full potential. Supervised trips to towns showed POWs a society that functioned like a well-oiled machine, contrasting sharply with their war-torn Europe. For German prisoners of war, life in America was already astonishing. They had witnessed orderly camps, bustling towns, massive factories, and organized farms, but it was their first supervised trips to civilian areas that truly opened their eyes. Leaving the relative isolation of the camps, the POWs saw everyday American life functioning at a level of efficiency and normalcy that seemed almost surreal. In towns and small cities, the streets were alive with energy. Cars moved smoothly along wide, well-maintained roads, while pedestrians crossed intersections with confidence. Storefronts displayed neatly ranged goods, from clothing to food, and advertisements promoted everything from household appliances to entertainment. The soldiers, accustomed to the destruction and scarcity of European cities, could hardly believe their eyes. No rubble, no shortages, no desperate crowds, just a society running seamlessly, almost as if the war were happening somewhere else. The POWs were also struck by the civility and friendliness of ordinary Americans. While every visit was carefully supervised, civilians greeted the prisoners with politeness and, in some cases, curiosity. Children waved, shopkeepers nodded, and townspeople carried on with their lives without hostility or fear. For soldiers trained to expect anger, hatred, or suspicion from the enemy, this kindness was almost disorienting. It challenged their preconceptions and offered a glimpse of a society that valued order, empathy, and cooperation even in wartime. Supervised trips revealed the deeper mechanics of America's society as well. POWs observed public transportation running on time, markets stocked with abundance, and essential services operating efficiently. Police officers, fire brigades, and municipal workers kept everything in order, reinforcing the impression that the nation was not only thriving, but organized to perfection. For men who had lived through rationing, bombing, and occupation, the contrast was shocking. America seemed to operate like a well-oiled machine, where every person and system contributed to the smooth functioning of society. The educational impact on the POWs was profound. They could see firsthand how a nation could maintain production, transportation, and public services under the immense pressures of war. Farms, factories, and towns were all interconnected, feeding into a larger system that maximized efficiency and output. These trips allowed POWs to witness the invisible infrastructure that supported America's industrial might, logistics, communication, and civic order working together seamlessly. Even small observations left a lasting impression. A bakery delivering bread, a milkman on his route, or a team of workers repairing a street, each task, no matter how mundane, demonstrated coordination and purpose. German soldiers, whose homeland had been scarred by inefficiency and disruption due to the war, began to understand that victory depended not only on soldiers and weapons, but on the flawless operation of a nation's internal systems. The psychological impact of these interactions was striking. POWs began to recognize that the strength of America was not just in its factories or machinery, but in its people, their discipline, cooperation, and adaptability. Civilians were as much a part of the war effort as the soldiers or industrial workers. The lessons they observed in towns reinforced what they had already seen in camps and factories: a nation capable of functioning efficiently, even under immense strain. By the end of these supervised visits, the German prisoners had absorbed a profound truth. Modern warfare was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the streets, homes, and workplaces of a nation. America's success lay in its ability to maintain normalcy, order, and productivity simultaneously, a level of societal organization the POWs had never imagined possible. In their reflections, many soldiers noted the stark contrast between the chaos of Europe and the stability they witnessed in America. The orderly towns, friendly civilians, and efficient infrastructure painted a picture of a nation whose power extended far beyond its armies. For these POWs, each trip into civilian life reinforced the awe and respect they felt toward the United States, leaving a lasting impression that would endure long after the war ended. Everything in Germany seemed slower, less organized. America was a factory-powered juggernaut. For German POWs, the more time they spent in America, the clearer the contrast became between their homeland and their captor nation. Back home, they had known a society strained by years of war, factories damaged by bombings, shortages of raw materials, disrupted supply lines, and an exhausted workforce. Now, confronted with the sheer scale, organization, and efficiency of American industry, everything they had known seemed inadequate by comparison. In Germany, production was often chaotic and fragmented. Factories were targets of constant Allied bombing campaigns, slowing down output and destroying critical infrastructure. Workers were overextended, and machinery was often outdated, repaired repeatedly to keep it running. The soldiers had experienced firsthand the logistical struggles of their own military delays in equipment, shortages of tanks, trucks, and ammunition. In stark contrast, America's factories operated like clockwork. Assembly lines moved with precision. Machinery functioned flawlessly, and the production capacity was staggering. One single factory could produce more tanks in a week than entire regions of Germany could manage in a month. Beyond sheer speed, the POWs noticed differences in organization and workflow. American industrial operations were highly systematized. Every task had a clear purpose. Every worker trained and coordinated. Every part accounted for. Materials flowed seamlessly from storage to assembly to finished product. In Germany, by comparison, inefficiencies abounded. Bottlenecks in supply chains, uneven skill levels among workers, and logistical breakdowns often slowed down production. The Germans had been trained to value discipline and efficiency in military operations. Yet the industrial systems they were witnessing in America exceeded anything they had experienced in their own country. Infrastructure and societal support amplified the effect. In the United States, towns, transport systems, and farms were all integrated into a larger network that supported industrial output. Railways delivered raw materials to factories. Highways transported finished vehicles to ports, and military depots and farmland ensured food security. German POWs could see how every part of the nation contributed to the war effort, in perfect synchronization. In Germany, by contrast, transportation networks had been disrupted by Allied attacks, rural areas suffered shortages, and entire cities lay in ruins. America's society, in its orderliness and coordination, seemed almost invincible. Even the human factor made a difference. American workers, well-fed, trained, and motivated, operated at full capacity with energy and focus. Civilians maintained public services, children attended school, and communities functioned smoothly, all contributing indirectly to industrial and military output. German soldiers, witnessing this, recognized that war production was not just about machines and factories, it was about a society functioning cohesively. In Germany, exhaustion, scarcity, and fear had undermined productivity and morale. In America, it seemed the exact opposite. A population mobilized, efficient, and resilient. The psychological impact on the POWs was profound. Many were forced to reassess their assumptions about the balance of power. Military strategy and bravery could only achieve so much. The true advantage lay in the ability to organize, supply, and produce at massive scale. Seeing America's factory-powered juggernaut made them realize that the war was being fought, not just on battlefields, but in production lines, railways, farms, and towns. It was a systemic power, one that Germany, in its war-weary state, could not match. By the time POWs had spent weeks observing, working, and traveling in America, the comparison was inescapable. Their homeland, once the epitome of military precision and discipline, now seemed slower, fragmented, and overwhelmed. America, by contrast, was a nation whose industrial, logistical, and societal machinery operated with relentless efficiency, a juggernaut whose strength extended far beyond weapons or soldiers. For the German prisoners, this comparison left a lasting impression. They returned to their camps with a newfound respect, astonishment, and, in some cases, humility. It was a lesson in modern warfare. Victory depended not only on courage, strategy, or numbers, but on the ability of an entire nation to organize, produce, and sustain itself. And in that realization, America's true power, industrial, societal, and unstoppable, became undeniable. Even in labor, POWs picked up the secrets of efficiency, lessons they never expected to learn from the enemy. For German prisoners of war, work assignments in America were initially intended as a practical way to assist with wartime labor shortages. Yet for many, these tasks became unexpected lessons in the art of efficiency, organization, and productivity. The POWs found themselves thrust into the heart of America's industrial and agricultural machine, learning firsthand how a nation could harness both human labor and mechanization to achieve extraordinary results. In factories, POWs handled small but essential tasks, tightening bolts, carrying components, or assisting with assembly. At first, these duties seemed menial, almost trivial, but as they observed the broader operation, it became clear that every step had been meticulously planned. Each worker had a specific role, and every action contributed to a larger rhythm that allowed tanks, planes, and vehicles to move down the assembly line with remarkable speed. POWs began to understand that efficiency wasn't just about working harder, it was about working smarter, in harmony with a well-coordinated system. Even in agricultural work, the lessons were profound. POWs operated machinery they had never seen before, mechanical harvesters, plows, and irrigation systems that allowed a few men to manage acres of crops. They watched how timing, precision, and planning could maximize output while minimizing wasted effort. These experiences revealed a level of operational sophistication far beyond what they had encountered in Germany, where labor was often strained, under-resourced, and disrupted by war. Observing American workers, POWs noticed more than just the machines. They noticed attitudes and methodology. Workers followed strict procedures, adhered to schedules, and maintained focus under pressure. There was an unspoken discipline, a shared understanding that every action mattered and every minute counted. For soldiers trained in military order, this mirrored the principles of coordinated action in battle but applied to industry. They realized that production, organization, and efficiency could become as powerful as soldiers and weapons in determining the outcome of a war. The POWs also began to see the role of innovation in maintaining efficiency. Factories were laid out for optimal workflow, materials were delivered just in time, and automation reduced human error. Even small adjustments like arranging tools or sequencing tasks had a profound impact on output. By participating in these processes, German soldiers inadvertently learned strategies that, had they been applied back home, could have improved production and reduced waste. They were witnessing firsthand the combination of human skill and engineering precision that made America's war effort unstoppable. Beyond technical skills, the labor programs imparted lessons in cooperation and coordination. POWs worked alongside each other and under American supervision, learning to adapt to standardized procedures and contribute to a larger system. They saw that efficiency wasn't achieved through individual effort alone, but through teamwork, organization, and adherence to well-designed processes. These insights were eye-opening, challenging long-held assumptions about labor, production, and the enemy itself. Psychologically, the experience was transformative. Soldiers who had expected to encounter hardship, hostility, or monotony found themselves engaged in productive work that demanded attention, skill, and thought. They were gaining knowledge and insights they would carry with them long after. The war secrets of efficiency and organizational mastery that no battle could have taught. Even in captivity, they were students of America's industrial genius, learning lessons about planning, coordination, and execution that transcended the battlefield. By the end of their assignments, POWs had developed a grudging admiration for the American workforce. They understood that war was not won solely on courage or strategy. It was sustained by efficiency, organization, and innovation. The lessons they learned while tightening bolts, operating machinery, or assisting with harvests revealed the hidden strength of a nation, capable of mobilizing both people and machines at an unprecedented scale. In the minds of German POWs, the labor programs became more than a necessity. They were a classroom. They had expected captivity, hardship, and isolation, yet found themselves learning the secrets of a productive, organized, and technologically advanced society. The lessons of efficiency, coordination, and innovation left a lasting impression, shaping their understanding of what it truly meant to be a nation prepared for war. German factories seemed tiny, almost fragile, compared to America's sprawling plants. For German POWs, one of the most striking revelations during their time in America was the sheer scale and sophistication of its industrial facilities. After months or even years of working within or observing European factories, they had a certain understanding of production, but nothing could prepare them for the sight of American plants, vast, humming with activity, and capable of producing in quantities that dwarfed anything back home. In Germany, factories were often constrained by limited resources, damaged infrastructure, and a workforce exhausted by years of war. Bombings had left large sections of industrial cities in ruins, and shortages of steel, fuel, and machinery were constant obstacles. Factories operated under strain, struggling to maintain output while coping with disrupted supply lines. By comparison, American plants were sprawling complexes, meticulously organized and fully supplied. POWs walked through massive assembly lines that stretched for hundreds of meters, watching hundreds of workers and machines performing synchronized tasks. The contrast was staggering. American factories were designed for speed, efficiency, and scale. Assembly lines produced tanks, trucks, and planes in continuous motion, with each station optimized for precision and minimal downtime. In Germany, production often lagged due to resource scarcity, maintenance delays, and human error. POWs noted that even when German factories were at full capacity, Their output was tiny compared to a single American plant operating smoothly. A tank that would take a month to produce in Germany could be finished in just days in the United States. The technological sophistication also impressed the prisoners. Machines performed tasks with pinpoint accuracy, welding, cutting, and assembling components in ways that required minimal human intervention. Automation, standardization, and industrial engineering had been applied at a scale the POWs had never witnessed. German factories, although advanced in some ways, appeared almost fragile in comparison, vulnerable to disruption and limited in capacity. Beyond machines, the scale extended to the layout and infrastructure. Raw materials arrived via rail and road in perfectly timed sequences. Finished products moved seamlessly from assembly to storage to shipment. The entire operation functioned like a living organism, with every part contributing to the continuous flow of production. German POWs, used to interruptions and inefficiencies, were astonished by the smooth orchestration. It was a production system designed to sustain a massive war effort without faltering. Even the human element contributed to the contrast. American workers were well-trained, motivated, and coordinated, moving in tandem with the machines they operated. In Germany, by contrast, overworked laborers often struggled to keep pace, and morale suffered under the relentless pressures of wartime shortages and bombings. POWs began to see that efficiency wasn't just a matter of machinery. It was a combination of technology, organization, and disciplined human labor. The psychological impact of this industrial contrast was profound. Soldiers who had once believed in the might of German engineering were humbled. They realized that victory in modern warfare depended not only on tactics, courage, or strategy, but on the capacity of a nation to produce, supply, and sustain its forces on an unprecedented scale. The American industrial juggernaut was not just impressive, it was decisive. By the time POWs had toured multiple factories and observed production firsthand, the impression was unmistakable. Germany's industrial might, once a source of national pride, now seemed fragile and limited. In America, factories were not just buildings, they were engines of war, capable of transforming raw materials into overwhelming military power with astonishing speed. For these prisoners, the lesson was clear. In modern conflict, industrial scale and efficiency could determine the outcome long before the first shot was fired. German factories, though competent, paled in comparison to America's sprawling, relentless production power. It was a revelation that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, shaping their understanding of the true strength of a nation mobilized for total war. For the first time, POWs understood why the Allies were winning and why America was the key. For German prisoners of war, the realization of Allied power didn't come from battles or propaganda, it came from firsthand observation in the factories, farms, and towns of America. They witnessed a nation operating with an efficiency and scale they had never imagined. Assembly lines churned out tanks, planes, and trucks faster than entire regions of Germany could manage, and farms produced more than enough food to sustain both civilians and soldiers. Every aspect of American society, from transportation to public services, was organized to support the war effort seamlessly. This stark contrast hit the POWs hardest when they compared their homeland to what they were seeing. German cities were bombed, factories were slow, and resources were stretched thin. Soldiers had experienced delays, shortages, and the constant strain of a nation under siege. America, in comparison, seemed almost invincible, not because of individual soldiers or strategy, but because of its industrial and logistical might. One visit to a factory, one trip to a bustling town, and the lesson was clear. The war was being won long before the first shot was fired. Even more revealing were the supervised trips into towns and interactions with civilians. POWs saw communities functioning flawlessly, transportation systems operating on schedule, and workers contributing tirelessly to the production machine. The Allied advantage wasn't just technology, it was society itself, mobilized and coordinated like a precision instrument. By the time they reflected on their experiences, POWs had a new understanding. America's industrial and organizational strength was the backbone of Allied success. Tanks, planes, and supplies rolled out at a pace Germany could not match, and the society that supported it all was orderly, resilient, and unstoppable. For these soldiers, it was a humbling revelation. America wasn't just a distant enemy, it was the engine driving the Allies to victory. Tanks, planes, ships. The real weapon of WWII wasn't just bullets, it was production capacity. German POWs quickly realized that modern warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Standing inside sprawling American factories, they saw tanks being assembled at speeds unimaginable back home, planes taking shape in giant hangars, and ships being prepared for deployment with astounding efficiency. The scale of production alone was a strategic advantage. America didn't just fight with soldiers, it fought with its factories, machines, and organized workforce. Every assembly line was a weapon in its own right. A single plant could produce more vehicles in a week than entire German regions could manage in a month. Automation, precise coordination, and well-trained labor allowed the U.S. to flood the front lines with supplies, giving the Allies an almost relentless advantage. POWs observed that the nation's capacity to produce war materials on a massive scale made even the most formidable armies seem vulnerable. It was a new kind of warfare, one where steel, labor, and logistics became the decisive factors. Even in agriculture and logistics, industrial power was at work. Farms produced enough food to sustain armies abroad, while railways and trucks ensured supplies reached where they became the ultimate weapon, shaping the outcome of conflicts long before troops even engaged the enemy. For POWs, it was humbling to witness. America's industrial power wasn't just supporting the war effort, it was the war effort needed most. German soldiers, accustomed to shortages and disrupted supply chains, were stunned by the seamless integration of industry and society. This understanding transformed their perception of war. Victory wasn't won solely by bravery or strategy on the battlefield, it was won in factories, workshops, and fields. Production capacity. German POWs left with a lesson they could never forget. Never underestimate the power of industry. Sometimes, the factories win the war before the soldiers even fight. As the war drew on, German prisoners in America carried more than memories of captivity, they carried a revelation. Every visit to a factory, every supervised trip to a town, every hour spent in labor programs revealed a truth that could not be ignored. America's industrial power was a weapon as lethal as any rifle or tank. The scale, efficiency, and precision of production left them in awe, forcing them to rethink the fundamentals of modern warfare. By the time the POWs returned home or reflected on their experiences in letters and diaries, they had witnessed a force unlike any they had seen on the battlefield. Entire cities seemed mobilized for war, every component of society contributing to a massive machine of production. Tanks, planes, trucks, and supplies poured from assembly lines at speeds that Germany could not match, proving that victory often depended less on courage or tactics, and more on the ability to sustain and equip an army continuously. The contrast was unforgettable. German factories, struggling under bombings, resource shortages, and human fatigue, appeared fragile compared to the sprawling, humming plants of the United States. Civilians contributed seamlessly, infrastructure supported every operation, and innovation drove every step of production. POWs learned firsthand that in modern conflict, industrial capacity could decide the outcome long before the first soldier even set foot on a battlefield. Ultimately, the lesson was clear and humbling. The might of a nation is not measured solely by its armies, but by its ability to organize, produce, and sustain itself. For German soldiers who had once underestimated their enemy, the realization was stark. Sometimes the factories win the war before the soldiers even fight. This insight would stay with them forever, a testament to the unstoppable power of American industry and the true engine behind Allied victory.